Who will be sacrificed for the Green New Deal and other global economic forum ideas? The Green New Deal, championed by various political leaders and global economic forums, aims to address climate change by radically transforming the global economy. While its proponents promise a future of clean energy, sustainable jobs, and environmental justice, the underlying question remains, who will bear the cost of this transformation? Historically, economic revolutions have always had winners and losers, and the Green New Deal is no exception. The potential sacrifices could disproportionately fall on the working class, developing nations, and vulnerable populations. The working class, the first casualties. At the heart of the Green New Deal is a sweeping overhaul of industries like fossil fuels, transportation, and manufacturing. While advocates suggest that green energy jobs will replace those lost in traditional sectors, the transition may not be as smooth as promised. Workers in coal, oil, and gas industries, for example, are at the forefront of those who could be sacrificed. In the rush to decarbonize, entire communities dependent on these industries may be left behind, as renewable energy jobs may not emerge quickly enough or provide the same level of compensation and benefits. Quotes from advocates of green energy often gloss over this harsh reality. Speaking at the World Economic Forum, John Kerry, U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, remarked, "The world needs to stop thinking of this transition as a cost and more as an investment. While that may hold true in the long term, those workers and families experiencing job displacement may not have the luxury of waiting for the long-term benefits to materialize." Developing nations. A new form of economic imperialism. Developing nations, already vulnerable due to weaker economies, could be disproportionately affected by global climate policies. The Green New Deal calls for reducing global carbon emissions, and international economic forums often push for restrictions on industrial activities in these nations. However, many developing countries are still in the process of industrializing. Limiting their growth in the name of sustainability can be seen as a new form of economic imperialism, where wealthy nations, having already industrialized and benefited from high emissions, now ask poorer countries to make sacrifices they themselves never made. A clear example is the push for carbon taxes and emission caps. These policies may hit countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America hardest. Many experts have pointed out that while wealthy nations have the resources to transition to renewable energy, poorer nations do not. As Bjorn Lomborg, a noted environmental economist, points out, the world's poorest people need energy to escape poverty, and yet the policies being advocated would make that energy more expensive and less accessible. This imbalance is further highlighted by initiatives like the Paris Agreement, which, while attempting to distribute responsibility for climate action, still places a heavy burden on nations least responsible for historical emissions. The result is a scenario where developing nations are asked to sacrifice their economic development in the name of global climate goals, goals largely shaped by wealthier industrialized nations. Population control, a hidden agenda? One of the more controversial aspects of global climate policy discussions involves population control. While proponents of the Green New Deal and other global economic forums may not explicitly advocate for population reduction, there is an underlying assumption that the planet's resources are insufficient to sustain current population growth. This concern leads some policymakers to consider strategies for limiting population growth as part of their climate solutions. In 2019, the environmentalist and filmmaker Michael Moore produced the documentary Planet of the Humans, which criticized the sustainability movement for ignoring the problem of population growth. In the film, Moore argues that renewable energy alone cannot save the planet if human population growth continues unchecked. The implication is clear. Any serious climate strategy must, in some form, address the issue of overpopulation. This idea is not new. Paul Ehrlich, the author of The Population Bomb, has long argued that population control is necessary to avert environmental disaster. Ehrlich famously wrote, "The key to understanding overpopulation is not population density, but rather the numbers of people in an area relative to its resources and the capacity of the environment to sustain human activities." While outright population control measures, such as those implemented by China's one-child policy, may not be politically feasible in many countries, the emphasis on reducing resource consumption inevitably leads to discussions about limiting population growth. The potential danger lies in how these ideas are implemented, particularly in developing nations where high birth rates are often a response to economic instability and lack of social safety nets. The marginalized, sacrificed in the name of progress. Marginalized populations, whether they are low-income communities, indigenous groups, or minority populations, often find themselves on the front lines of environmental policies. For example, in the U.S., many green energy projects such as solar farms and wind turbines are constructed in rural or indigenous areas, where local communities have little say in the matter. These communities may find their land taken or their traditional ways of life disrupted in the name of progress. Naomi Klein, in her book This Changes Everything: Capitalism versus the Climate, warns of the dangers of green colonialism, where environmental policies are imposed on vulnerable populations without their consent. She argues that the sacrifices demanded of low-income and minority communities in the name of sustainability are too often ignored by policymakers and corporations. Conclusion: the real cost of the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal and similar initiatives emerging from global economic forums aim to address an urgent and existential threat: climate change. However, the cost of these initiatives may not be borne equally. Working-class individuals, developing nations, and marginalized communities are at risk of being sacrificed in the rush to implement broad and sweeping changes. Moreover, concerns about overpopulation raise troubling ethical questions about whose lives are deemed expendable in the pursuit of sustainability. As policymakers move forward, it is crucial to ensure that the burden of addressing climate change does not fall disproportionately on those least able to bear it. The global community must balance environmental imperatives with social and economic justice, ensuring that the sacrifices demanded are equitably distributed. In the words of environmental justice advocate Robert Bullard, environmental justice and climate justice are inextricably linked. We can't solve one without addressing the other. The challenge, then, is to create a future where the sacrifices made for climate action are not only effective, but also just.